So I read a book once called Reaping the Whirlwind, which was written by a Christian lady. And she followed South Africa's path into the occult. And I say often, all people groups in South Africa committed this country to the occult. All people groups in this country. It might be easy for me to say, no, it's the ancestor worship, right? Our people, the white people, we sold ourselves out to Freemasonry and the Broederbond, okay? And I think there's very clear consequences of it. I think at the moment we're reaping it socially. And we are starting to reap it economically. I have an opinion. I can't verify it, of course. I have an opinion that if we didn't have this deep-rooted us versus them, which I think was established also through stuff like Freemasonry, if we didn't have that, maybe this animistic response would have also not been so big. And it's a spiritual battle, I agree. Ironically, however, South Africa is the biggest economy in Africa, even though we have the most animism and the most social conflict in that sense, okay? So I do think we still do have a good foundation somewhere. We need to go back to it, though. You should read these quotes by John Dube. Yeah, he was the founding member of the ANC. When I read that, my heart wept because I realized we had foundations that were good. So good. And how he really wept for Black South Africa being uplifted. And he did it from the perspective of, I'm a Christian and I want to see it uplifted. Okay? We've departed from that as a country. We've become a greedy nation. Yeah, we've become a greedy nation. And we've become a divided nation. I want what you've got. And everybody wants what the other wants. Yeah.
The question that I've been having on my heart now for a bit now is what is the role of the struggle between principalities and the church not allowing these things to happen?
There's a big role. I can just share an example, just a small example. We see on our campuses people coming, doing ancestor worship, openly. I've walked to my building, not my building, our building, our building, and I just pick up in the spirit somebody's sitting there, and he looks at me in the eyes, he says, come here. And I just talk to him in the spirit. I say, I'm not coming here. You go away in the name of Jesus and you leave your nonsense. He gets up and he walks away. There is serious spiritual contention, and I saw it on our campuses in the last 2 years. Serious, and it's open. We have students burning in pepper to the ancestors on the Roy Plain, invoking the spirit of Sobukwe, invoking the spirit of Tambo. This is happening openly. So what was our response? We as Christians, we got together and we prayed on the Roy Plain. You know how we saw time and again how these things were disarmed. Time and again, disarmed. And how these things that were intended for curse didn't happen. We as a church have a big role. I remember in 2012, it was the 100th anniversary of the ANC. There was a big controversy surrounding Jacob Zuma, who was going to sacrifice a bull. There was a call to prayer to actually bring us back to the foundations of the ANC leadership, the Christian foundations. Because I believe Christ is the cornerstone of this country. I don't think we would still be here if Christ wasn't the cornerstone of this country. I honestly believe it. I believe we're at a knife's edge. We really are, again. But Christ is still the cornerstone of this country. He built this country, even though things got messed up. Even though our hearts strayed. Okay, our hearts strayed. And we're reaping the whirlwind. Okay. We're reaping the whirlwind. So it's important for us as a church to get back to basics. And I saw last night Angus Buchan is calling for a national day of prayer. If you read the books written by William Wilberforce during the time of the slave trade, they still had national days of prayer and repentance. National days, not churches. The nation came down and prayed and repented. We can and should do that. We can, because Christ doesn't forget that he's the cornerstone here. He doesn't. He hasn't left. I firmly believe that. That's why I haven't left. Okay? People ask me, aren't you crazy to stay? I'm like, I can't. Can't leave. Okay. Can't leave. Yeah. So yes, we have poverty declining, but inequality rising. Why? Because we have a growing black middle class. Okay? But unemployment has risen. So again, you just see these strange dynamics. So let's show you some of these figures. Poverty declined. Okay? From 2008 to 2012, that blue bar going down. 50% of people in poverty in 2008, down to 40%. Generally, what we see here is that children live in households that are more poor. Okay? So this is why, for instance, the child support grant might be important, because children tend to live in houses that are more poor. So about 60% of children lived in households that were poor, 50% by 2012. Okay. So this is the social grants, to be frank. Nothing else, because unemployment rose. Okay, that's the next graph. Here we see in 1994, approximately, unemployment was down at 16%. Okay, so if you tell somebody in a developed economy unemployment is 16%, they'll tell you, gee, that's disgusting, disgustingly high. But that's nothing compared to the 30% at its peak. Okay, and this is only the official definition of employment. Here we are ignoring people who've given up looking for a job. Do you know that we don't count them as unemployed in South Africa? Because that's the international definition. If we did that at this stage, it would have been about 40%, right? 40%. So at the moment, unemployment is unfortunately rising again, and we again at our high levels. And yeah, so despite this economic growth, we didn't see a decline in unemployment. So it's again this disconnect of what happens on the broad scale and what people are benefiting from. Okay. So what's the problem in South Africa? And I've briefly touched on it. We are so different from other developing countries. I'm not even talking developed countries. Okay. If you can just the next slide, please. So usually in developing countries, you have these large self-employment informal sectors, as I've discussed. You've got a very small formal sector and low unemployment. Okay? Unemployment in many African economies is about 5%. Why? Because people are moving into the formal sector. So the question is, the informal sector. If unemployment is so high in South Africa, why isn't everybody just moving into the informal sector like in other economies? It suggests there's something preventing people from doing this, right? So in South Africa, we have this very small informal sector, very low levels of self-employment. Okay, that comes back to our discussion on the grants, right? Do grants prevent people from actually creating their own economic opportunities? We've got a huge public sector. Huge. Who's doing most of the employing? It's the government. It's not private enterprise that's being promoted, right? It's a centralized thing, okay? And we have these huge, high unemployment, and the question is why, and my guess is it's these apartheid-era restrictions on informality. I suggested the Group Areas Act, I suggested the Land Act. These things have not disappeared overnight. Okay. And in actual fact, it's a sense of poverty that we've lost in these 100 years, a sense of entrepreneurism. And that's a spiritual poverty. right? That's a spiritual poverty. And this shows you how evil laws can be to introduce a spiritual poverty by removing people's means to be able to provide for themselves. Okay? It's a definite spiritual poverty. So here, just to show you, okay, this biggest block over here is brown, this brown block. It says NEA, that's people who are not economically active. They're doing nothing. Okay, not economically active. The next block over here, this one, that's the formal sector. It's fairly big in South Africa compared to other developing countries. This is the first world economy. That's the, if we're thinking of dual economy, that's the rich part. That's the part that's doing well. Commercial agriculture, not too bad. Here, this blue block is the searching unemployed. It's 13%, but the actual unemployment rate is higher. It's due to measurement issues. I'm not going to go into that right now. But what's the very small bit here? You see this little slice, informal, this little red informal slice. And where is the subsistence agriculture? I can't even see it. It's this yellow slice over there. Okay. Compare that to Malawi. Subsistence farming, the biggest one. People able to do something for themselves. Even if it's not making them rich, they can still live. Okay? Because they're able to plant something in the soil. What's the second one? Ganyu labor. It's also a form of informal labor. It's not part of the formal sector. It's also part of the informal sector. Again, it's not well paid, but people at least have something to put on the table. Okay? And then compare that to unemployed in Malawi. That's the slice you cannot see. Okay? So very few people in Malawi who are doing nothing. In South Africa, we have this, in a sense, this poverty of many people doing nothing. So it's this question, what's the poverty? Is it a resource poverty or is it a skills poverty? Which I'd go as far as saying, is it in a sense, a spiritual poverty? Something that's been robbed from people. So if your resource was robbed, you've got no opportunity to develop the skill, right? And it wasn't just your resource that was robbed, it was also a spiritual robbery in that sense. So how do you restore that? Okay, sure, we just we do land restitution. Great. We've restored the resource poverty. We haven't addressed the other two poverties. And I think there's something important to be said for it. We often hear this allegation that in the discourse that the church in South Africa has not repented for apartheid. Even though individuals have, there's this allegation that the church as a broad hasn't done it to restore the spiritual poverty, that spiritual robbery in a sense. And it's maybe something we should discuss, right? Because I think these are interlinked, the resource poverty, the skills poverty, what we call human capital as economists, and also then the spiritual poverty, which many economists won't speak about. If we go to the next table, here we're comparing ourselves to Brazil. Brazil is always the economy that we compare ourselves to because we're part of the BRICS. They struggled with very high inequality. There was a stage when they beat us. They no longer do. They're getting something right. Okay, so in Brazil, 25 to 30% of people are self-employed. In South Africa, it's 5 to 7. It just reinforces that point. Okay, just reinforces that point. We also have very few small firms, right? So in South Africa, approximately 20% of people work in firms of 4 or less. In Brazil, that's almost 50%. Okay, almost 50%. Very, very different. So it suggests in South Africa, we're depending on the big guys. We think the big guys must do it all for us. The big corporates, the big government, the big this, the big that. It's again reflective of the spiritual poverty, right? We expect the big guys to do it, and I'm just going to say what now? Okay, and I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying this is generally what the spiritual decay that we have. Yeah.